My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, I walked into my parents' house in Franklin carrying a pie I had spent 3 days making, and I walked out 40 minutes later without eating a single bite of dinner. What happened in between those 40 minutes changed everything, not just for me, but for every person sitting at that table who thought they knew exactly where I belonged. Keep watching, because by the end of this story, you will see how the daughter they called an embarrassment became the only one they could not afford to ignore. So, let me take you back to that Thursday in November. The drive from my apartment in East Nashville to my parents' house took just under 30 minutes, and I spent most of it with the windows cracked and the radio off. The autumn air smelled like wood smoke and something sweet drifting from a neighbor's yard. I had the pie sitting on the passenger seat, boxed carefully, the edges wrapped in brown parchment paper the way I always packed my work. Brown butter apple tart with a honey glaze and a crust I had made from scratch the night before. I had been up until midnight pressing the dough, and my wrists still ached from it. I told myself the ache was worth it. I told myself a lot of things on that drive. My parents' house sat at the end of a long driveway lined with oak trees that had gone deep orange and red by late November. The house itself was wide and white with a wraparound porch that always looked good in photographs. My mother loved photographs. The whole front of the house was lit up, cars parked 3 deep in the driveway, and I could already hear voices from the yard as I cut the engine. Inside, the house was warm and loud the way it always was when the whole family gathered. My aunts had claimed the kitchen. My cousins crowded the living room with the football game on. My mother moved through the hallway with the particular efficiency she saved for holidays, her dark hair pinned back, a dish towel tucked into her apron. She kissed my cheek when she saw me and said the pie looked beautiful without really looking at it. My father stood at the head of the dining room, already in his chair, already holding court the way he always did. He was a broad man with thick hands and a voice that filled rooms without effort. He had built Vasquez Family Kitchen from one location in Franklin into 4 restaurants across Tennessee over the past 20 years, and he carried that achievement the way some men carry a weapon always within reach, always ready to remind you it was there. My older brother Daniel sat to his right. Daniel was 33 and had worked in the restaurants since he was 16. He knew the vendors, knew the managers, knew the numbers. He had my father's same straight posture and the same way of nodding slowly when he wanted you to know he had already thought of what you were about to say. His fiancée, Priya, was beside him, quiet and watchful the way she always was in our family gatherings. I found a seat near my Aunt Rosa, who squeezed my hand when I sat down and told me I looked tired. I said I had been baking. She said that was no surprise. For the first hour, everything stayed in its usual shape. Food passed around the table, conversations layered over each other. My father talked about the new location they were planning in Brentwood, how the lease negotiations had gone, how he expected it to be the strongest Vasquez kitchen yet. Daniel added details, filled in numbers, and my father listened to him the way he listened to almost no one else fully, with his whole attention settled like something solid. I ate my bread and watched them the way I had been watching them since I was old enough to understand what I was seeing. Then my father tapped his glass. The room quieted the way it always did when he wanted it to. He was not a man who had to ask twice for anything. He stood and thanked everyone for being there. He talked about the family, about what it meant to him that we were all still gathered around one table. He looked at Daniel and said that next year, when the Brentwood location opened, the family business would reach something he had been working toward for a long time. His voice went warm and certain in the way it only did when he was talking about the restaurants. He said Daniel had shown real leadership this year. He said he was proud of the man his son had become. Then, his eyes moved down the table and found me. I had been waiting for it. I had been waiting the way you wait for a storm you can already smell coming. He said he had something to address. His voice did not change temperature, which was somehow worse than if it had. He said that over the past year, my choices had been a source of embarrassment to this family. He said that when I walked away from the restaurant to pursue what he called a hobby, his word, spoken flatly, with exactly the weight he intended it to carry, I had turned my back on everything he had built and everything he had offered me. He said he had given me every opportunity to be part of something real, and I had chosen foolishness instead. He said it in front of everyone at that table, aunts and cousins and Daniel's future in-laws who had only met me twice. He said it without raising his voice, which made it land harder than shouting would have. The room went very still. My cousin Marco stopped mid-reach for the green beans. My Aunt Rosa's hand tightened around her fork. Priya looked down at her plate. Daniel's jaw shifted, and he opened his mouth, and then closed it, and looked at the tablecloth. I felt the heat crawl up the back of my neck. I had been expecting something, but not this public, not this deliberate, not with the whole family watching to see what I would do. I set down my fork carefully. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs under the table until they stopped trembling, and then I pushed back my chair and stood up. I told him I had not walked away from the family. I told him I had walked towards something I actually believed in, and there was a difference. I told him that calling my work a hobby in front of everyone did not make it one. I told him that a daughter who builds something real does not become an embarrassment simply because what she builds does not have his name on it. My voice stayed level. I do not know how, but it did. Then I picked up my pie from the side table where I had set it when I came in, and I walked out the front door. The cold hit me the moment I stepped onto the porch. November in Franklin gets sharp after dark, and I had left my jacket on the coat rack inside. I stood there for a moment with the pie in my hands, and my breath making small clouds in the air, and I did not go back for the jacket. I walked to my car, put the pie on the passenger seat, and I sat there for a full minute with my hands on the steering wheel before I started the engine. Aunt Rosa came out before I pulled away. She knocked on the passenger window, and I rolled it down, and she leaned in and looked at me the way she had looked at me when I was small and had scraped a knee and was trying hard not to cry. She said my father was wrong. She said she had watched me work and she knew what I was building was real. She said the people at that table loved me even when they did not know how to say it. I told her I knew. I told her I was not leaving because I was broken. I was leaving because I was done sitting at a table where I had to prove I deserved a seat. She held my hand through the open window for a moment. Then she let go, and I drove home. I need to tell you what my father was so certain I had walked away from, so you can understand what I chose instead. 3 years before that Thanksgiving, when I was 26, my father called me into his office at the original Vasquez kitchen on Main Street and offered me the position of corporate operations manager for the restaurant group. It was a real offer, good salary, real responsibility, a title that would mean something on a resume. He told me that Daniel was taking over the expansion side, and he needed someone he trusted to hold the operations together. He said family was the only thing he trusted with something that important. I had been working in the restaurant as a pastry cook since I was in culinary school. I had spent 3 years learning the kitchen, learning the business, learning what our family's food meant to the people who came in every week. I loved those years. I want to be honest about that I genuinely loved them. But somewhere in those 3 years I had also started to understand that what I wanted to build was not the same thing as what my father had built. What I wanted was smaller and mine. A bakery, 12 seats maybe. A counter with pastries and bread and coffee. A place where I could decide the entire menu from scratch, where every single thing on the shelf came from my hands and my recipes. I had been writing ideas in notebooks for 2 years by then. I had names picked out. I had sketched the counter display in the margins of my prep notes at the restaurant. When I told my father I needed time to think about the offer, the temperature in that office changed immediately. He looked at me the way he looked at vendors who tried to renegotiate on short notice. He told me there was nothing to think about. He told me the offer was generous and I was being sentimental. He told me that Daniel was not given the luxury of sitting around thinking about what he wanted. He had committed to the family, and that was that. I asked him if I could keep some outside projects if I took the role. He told me that if I was going to be serious about the business, I needed to be serious about the business. No halfway, no hobby on the side. I quit 2 weeks later. He did not speak to me for 6 weeks after that. When he did, it was brief and transactional in the way he could be when he had closed a door and moved on. My mother called more often, and her calls always circled back to the same plea. Just come back. Just try it for a year. Just give him something to work with. I listened to her, and I told her I loved her, and I kept baking. I found a space on a side street in East Nashville, a storefront that had been a tailor shop for decades before the owner retired. The windows faced east. which meant good morning light, which mattered more to me than almost anything else. I signed the lease on a Tuesday in February with my savings and a loan I had been paying down for 14 months since. I named the place Flower and Honest, which my Aunt Rosa said sounded like either a poem or a very small law firm, and I told her I would take either. The first 6 months were hard in a way I had expected and still was not prepared for. I worked 16-hour days alone. I burned things. I miscalculated quantities. I had 1 week in April where I ran the numbers every night and could not see how I was going to make rent. I called Aunt Rosa at 11 on a Wednesday and sat on the floor of the bakery surrounded by sheet pans and told her I was not sure I was going to make it. She told me to get up off the floor and go to bed and look at the numbers again in the morning, which was not particularly comforting in the moment. But she was right. By September, I had a regular morning line. By October, a food writer from a local magazine had come in twice and then written 4 paragraphs about my brown butter quinamon that I read so many times I had it memorized. By the following spring, Flower and Honest had a 6-month wait list for custom wedding cakes. My father heard about the magazine piece from someone at his golf club. He did not call me about it. Daniel sent me a text that said, "Nice write-up." I said thank you, and we left it there. Then came that Thanksgiving, and I walked out with my pie, and the next chapter of both our stories started whether either of us was ready for it or not. The week after Thanksgiving, I got back to work. There is a particular focus that comes from anger, when you have enough of it and you can turn it in the right direction. And that winter I had plenty of both. I hired my first full-time employee, a recent culinary school graduate named Jess, who showed up on her first day with her own knife roll and a level of organized intensity that made me feel like I had been running a very good mess until that point. She was 23 and had never held a job longer than 8 months, and she told me directly in the interview that she wanted to learn every part of the business, not just stand at a station. I hired her that afternoon. Jess and I spent the winter developing a wholesale line, individually packaged pastries for coffee shops and specialty grocers in the Nashville area. It was my idea to pitch it, but Jess built the pitch deck, and it was better than anything I could have put together on my own. We landed 3 coffee shop accounts in January and a boutique grocery in February, and by March we needed a second mixer and more freezer space. In April, a hospitality group that operated several upscale hotels in the Southeast reached out. They were building a new property in downtown Nashville set to open the following year, and they wanted a local bakery as their exclusive pastry vendor for the hotel, restaurant, and all in-room amenity packages. The contract they sent over was 3 years, and the figure was large enough that I read it twice and then called Jess into the back and made her read it while I stood there. She looked up from the paper and said, very calmly, that we were going to need a bigger kitchen. I sat on the edge of the prep table and pressed my hands together and thought about my father calling my work foolishness at the Thanksgiving table, and I thought about the 6 months on that bakery floor wondering if I was going to make rent. I thought about the notebooks full of ideas I had kept for years. I signed the contract on a Wednesday, and Jess and I celebrated with the leftover croissants from the morning service because it was 10 o'clock at night and nothing else was open. My brother Daniel called in June. His voice had the careful, measured quality I recognized from when we were kids, and he was trying to mediate something between me and our father without appearing to take sides. He said he had heard about the hotel contract and that the business was doing well, and he said that as far as he could tell, I had done something genuinely impressive. I thanked him and waited, because there was always a turn. The turn came about 3 sentences later. He told me that my father was still hurt, that the way things had played out at Thanksgiving had left a wound, and that if I was willing to make some kind of gesture, call him, visit, show some acknowledgement of how the situation had affected the family, my father would likely receive it well. He said our father was not the type to ask for things directly, but that he was a man who responded to respect. I let Daniel finish. Then I asked him something I had been carrying for a long time. I asked him when my father had ever made a gesture toward me, when he had ever called to ask how the business was going, or come in and sat down at the counter and tried one of the things I had spent years learning how to make. When anyone in that family had treated my work like something worth the same acknowledgement they gave every ribbon cutting at a new Vasquez kitchen location. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He said he understood where I was coming from. He said he hoped things could be better between all of us. I said I hoped so too, and I meant it. But hoping was not the same as going back to that table with a peace offering in my hands, and I told him that as kindly as I could. My mother and I had lunch in July. She chose a restaurant halfway between our two neighborhoods, a safe, neutral territory, and she was already seated when I arrived. Her hands wrapped around a glass of water, her posture exactly as composed as it always was in public. She looked older to me that afternoon in the way that people can age suddenly between visits. She asked about the business, and I told her about the hotel contract, and her face did something complicated that I could not fully read, something between pride and grief. Then she told me she wanted me to consider that my father had never had a daughter who did not need him, and that what I had done by leaving was something he did not have a framework for. She said he showed love through provision, through opportunity, and when I turned down his opportunity, he experienced it as a rejection of himself. She said she was not excusing him. She said she was trying to explain him. I listened to everything she said. I stirred my coffee and I sat with it. Then I told her the truth I had never said out loud to her before. I told her that I had spent years trying to earn a specific kind of approval from him, and that I had finally understood the approval he was capable of giving was conditional on becoming something I was not. I told her I did not blame her for the way our family was built, but I was not willing to keep trading pieces of myself for a seat at a table that would only welcome me on his terms. Her eyes filled, and she reached across and put her hand over mine, and she said she just wanted her family not to be broken. I squeezed her hand. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, but I was also not going to pretend that what happened at Thanksgiving was simply a rough holiday that everyone needed to get past. That fall, the trouble at Vasquez family kitchen started becoming visible from the outside. Daniel called me again in October, and this time his voice had lost all its careful mediation. He sounded exhausted. He told me that the original Franklin location had seen a significant drop in revenue for the third consecutive quarter. The clientele had been changing, he said. Younger customers, different expectations, a different relationship to food and branding, and what a restaurant was supposed to feel like. The Vasquez family kitchen identity had not changed in over a decade. The logo was the same one their father had designed in the 90s. The website looked like something printed on paper and then photographed. The social media presence was inconsistent and, in Daniel's words, embarrassing. They had lost a major catering contract with a corporate client who told them frankly that the brand felt dated and did not align with the image the client wanted associated with their events. The new Brentwood location, which had opened that summer, was underperforming every projection. My father had held an internal meeting, Daniel said. He had told the managers the problem was temporary, that reputation was built over decades and did not evaporate over a bad quarter, that the Vasquez name still meant something in this market and always would. But the younger managers were restless, and at least 2 of them had sent their resumes to competing restaurant groups. Then Daniel told me the part that required him to pause before he said it. He told me that at the last meeting, when someone finally said the word rebrand out loud, my father had not rejected it. He had gone quiet, which was something that almost never happened. He had looked at the numbers for a long time, and then he had looked at Daniel, and said almost quietly, almost like it cost him something even to consider it, that maybe they needed someone who understood both the food and the brand. Daniel said he had told my father there was one person who fit that description. He said my father had not argued. My father called me himself 2 weeks later. He called on a Tuesday morning, and I almost did not answer because I did not recognize the number he was calling from his office line, not his cell, which I realized later was deliberate. Something about it being a business call before it was anything else. His voice was formal and clipped, and he said he needed to discuss a professional matter. He said he would prefer to do it in person and asked if I was available later in the week. I met him at the Franklin location, in the small office in the back that still had the same wood paneling from when I was a child, and used to sit in the corner and do homework while he went over the books. He was behind the desk, his jacket still on. He looked at me for a moment before he said anything. He said the business was facing a significant challenge. He said the brand needed work, the kind of work that required someone who understood what Vasquez Family Kitchen was at its core: the food, the family history, the reason people had come through those doors for 20 years, and could translate that into something that spoke to where the market was now. He said he had looked at outside agencies and found them too far removed from the thing itself. He said he needed someone with a real connection to what the brand actually meant. Then he said something I had not expected. He said he had been to Flower and Honest twice. He said he had sat at the counter both times and had coffee and one of the things I made, and he had watched the room for an hour. He said what I had built had a quality he recognized, the same quality his restaurants had had in the early years, when every detail was intentional and every person in the room felt like they were somewhere that had been made specifically for them. He said he needed that quality again, and he did not know how to get it back on his own. The room was very still. I could hear the kitchen sounds coming through the wall, the way I had heard them my whole life. I told him I was willing to help Vasquez Family Kitchen as a consulting client of Flower and Honest. I told him I would bring Jess into the work, and we would approach it the same way we approached any project research. Honesty. No shortcuts. I told him I would tell him the truth about what needed to change, even when it was hard to hear. And I expected him to receive that truth the same way he would from any professional he was paying. I told him this was not me coming home. This was me doing my job. He looked at the desk for a moment. Then he nodded and said he understood. He said he was glad I came. The work took 6 months. Jess and I embedded ourselves in the restaurant operations in a way that required me to set aside a complicated weight of history every single morning. I had to see the business the way a stranger would see it, and I had to see it the way someone who had grown up inside it would see it. And I had to hold both of those perspectives at the same time without letting either one lie to me. The visual identity was the most visible problem. We stripped the logo back to something clean and warm and designed around the actual food rather than around a formal presentation of the family name. The new palette was earthy and honest, the colors of good bread, good vegetables, the particular shade of copper that cast iron takes on when it is used every day. The new website told the story of the restaurants through the food and the people who made it. We pulled old photographs from my father's archive, real images from the early years of the first location, the kitchen in its first summer, my grandfather's hands on a stock pot, and we built the new brand around that foundation. The harder work was the menu conversation. I told my father that 3 of his signature dishes needed to be reworked, not because they were wrong, but because the execution had drifted over the years as costs were cut and shortcuts accumulated. And the customers who remembered those dishes from 10 years ago could taste the difference even if they could not articulate it. He resisted. He said the recipes were the recipes. I showed him the comment data and the review patterns, and I told him he could disagree with me, but he could not disagree with what his own customers were saying. He worked with the kitchen team on 2 of the 3 dishes. The third he held firm on, and I let him hold it, because some things are not about strategy. The numbers moved before the rebrand was fully complete. The new website drove inquiry volume up before the end of the 2nd month. The catering side had 3 new corporate inquiries in December alone. By February, the Franklin location had its best revenue month in 2 years. In March, the Nashville Business Journal ran a feature on the Vasquez Family Kitchen turnaround. The article was generous and detailed and named Flower and Honest specifically, calling the work an example of brand identity done from the inside out. A photograph ran with it, my father and Daniel standing in front of the Franklin location, and a separate image of Jess and me in the Flower and Honest kitchen. 2 different businesses, 2 different stories, both named. My father called the morning the article ran. He said he had seen it. There was a pause that lasted long enough that I understood something was working against his instinct to simply move on to business. He said, finally, that what I had done for the restaurants was more than he had expected. He said the work was good. He said that watching me work, really watching, over those 6 months had shown him something he had not seen clearly before. I waited, standing in the kitchen of Flower and Honest with the phone against my ear and the early morning light coming through the east-facing windows. He said he had been wrong to call my choices an embarrassment. He said it in a plain and undecorated way, without qualifications or context, and I understood that this was as close to the center of the thing as he was capable of getting on a phone call on a Tuesday morning. I told him I heard him. I told him that the work we had done together had meant something to me, not because of what it accomplished for the business, but because it had let me show him the thing I had spent 3 years building alone. I told him I had needed him to see it, and now he had. He said he wished he had seen it sooner. We stayed on the line for another moment without much to say. Then he told me he had a board meeting and needed to go, which was my father's version of intimacy, staying on the line 2 minutes longer than he needed to. Thanksgiving came again, and I drove back out to Franklin with a different pie. Salted caramel chess pie, which was one of my mother's favorites, made with the same care and the same early morning kitchen hours as the year before. The driveway had the same oaks, gone orange and red again. The house was lit up and loud. My cousin Marco waved at me from the porch when I pulled in. Inside, my mother hugged me for a long time and did not let go until I laughed and told her the pie was going to get crushed. Daniel came and shook my hand and held it for a second longer than usual. Priya, who was now his wife of 4 months, squeezed my arm and said she had been to Flower and Honest the week before, and the cardamom morning bun had made her cry, which was the best thing anyone had ever said about any of my food. Aunt Rosa found me in the kitchen and looked at my face and said I seemed different. I told her I felt different. She nodded like she had known that would happen eventually and poured herself more wine. At the table, my father stood for the same toast he gave every year. He thanked everyone for being there. He talked about the family. He talked about what another year of being together meant to him. Then he looked down the table at me. He said that this past year, he had watched his daughter take a business she had built alone and use it to help bring something else back from a hard season. He said the work had been honest, and it had been skilled, and it had reminded him of what it looked like when someone truly knew what they were doing. He said Flower and Honest had been named one of Nashville's top new food businesses, and that the person responsible for that had been building toward it for years while he had not been paying close enough attention. He said he was proud. The table was quiet for a moment, the way tables go quiet when something real is said out loud in a room full of people who are used to things being left implied. My aunt pressed her lips together. Daniel raised his glass. Jess, who I had brought as a guest because she had become the kind of person I wanted present for things that mattered, looked down at her plate with a small smile. I raised my glass back. I said thank you, and I meant it without needing it to be more than it was. After dinner, I stood on that wraparound porch in the dark with a cup of coffee, looking at the oak trees in the yard, bare by now, all the red and orange gone. Aunt Rosa came and stood beside me and did not say anything for a while, which was one of the things I loved most about her. Then she said she had known since I was 12 years old and brought a lemon tart to a family birthday party that no one had asked me to make, that I was going to be exactly this. I asked her why she had never said so. She said some things needed to be found rather than told. The cold was coming through my coat, and the light from inside the house fell warm across the porch boards, and I thought about all the years of sitting at that table feeling like something the family tolerated rather than chose. I thought about the October I was almost out of money, and the February I first made rent with room to spare. I thought about Jess reading that hotel contract at the prep table, and Aunt Rosa on the phone telling me to get up off the floor, and my father standing in front of his numbers and saying out loud the name of someone he had spent years dismissing. I did not need that acknowledgement to know what I had built. I want to be clear about that. I had known what I built on my own long before he had words for it, but I would be dishonest with you if I said it meant nothing. It meant something, not because his approval completed me, but because it was the truth said out loud in the right room at the right time, and truth like that has its own weight. I went back inside. The dishes were being cleared and someone had started coffee, and the children were chasing each other around the furniture, and the noise level had climbed back to its usual holiday pitch. I found a seat beside my mother, and she handed me a slice of the salted caramel pie I had made and said it was the best version of it she had ever tasted. I told her I had changed the recipe this year, added a little more salt, a little longer in the oven. She said she could taste the difference. I said that was the whole point. Have you ever been told that the thing you love most is not worth building? Share your story below, and if you believe your worth was never theirs to decide, hit like and subscribe, because we are going to keep telling these stories as long as there are people brave enough to live them.